So, welcome, Kiran. Thank you so much for joining me today. I have really been looking forward to this for a long time. I've been pestering pestering you for months to do a talk with me on endo and the microbiome, and I'm so glad the day is here. Welcome to everyone who's here. Yes, your mics will automatically be muted, so please keep them muted for the duration of our talk. And yeah, if I'm not sure if we've gotten to know each other before or not, but if you don't, I'm Kimberly. I'm a naturopath and clinical nutritionist specializing in care specifically for women with endo. And Kiran joining me here is a absolute whiz and renowned microbiologist, and I'm so looking forward to picking your brain today to talk all things endo and the microbiome.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm glad we were finally able to get this put together. I know we've got crazy time zone differences and whatnot, but it's such an important topic. I think it's so actionable of a topic. There's so many things one can do to improve the condition and the situation and the risks and so on. So I think it's so important to talk about this. So thank you for having me.
You are so welcome. I'm so glad you're here. So, why don't we just delve straight into it? Because I'm sure everyone's hungry and keen to learn more. So, the first thing I want to talk about, and it's something that I've, constantly just devouring this research around endometriosis, the gut bacteria, dysbiosis, the bacterial contamination hypothesis. So, regarding this gram-negative bacteria in the pelvis influencing the pelvic microbiome. So, please tell us a little bit more about the differences between, gram-positive, gram-negative bacteria, the role of lipopolysaccharides, and the impact on systemic health and inflammation.
Yeah, so the important thing to note between gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria is that gram-positive bacteria have what we call a cell wall structure, right? And the reason it's called gram-positive is early days of microbiology, when you're understanding and studying bacteria, you have something called the gram stain. The
Mm.
gram stain is something that was developed by early microbiologists where you could put a particular colored stain on a cell, so on a bacterial cell, and when you look at it under a fluorescent microscope, if the cell picks up the stain, it means it has a cell wall structure that makes it gram positive. If it doesn't pick up the stain, it means it doesn't have the cell wall. It only has a cell membrane, and so it doesn't pick up the stain, and that means it's gram negative. So visually, you can actually see the gram positive bacteria as being a completely different color than the gram negative bacteria, right? So that's where the term comes from. But what it actually means to be gram negative is that you don't have a cell wall structure. You do have a cell membrane that's a lipid bilayer. And in between that lipid bilayer, you've got LPS,
Mhm.
lipopolysaccharide. So, lipopolysaccharide is this very unique, we call it an endotoxin
Mm.
because it's a toxin that's made by the bacteria, typically in your body itself. And it is a very toxigenic compound when it's not in the bacteria, when it's especially when it's released, if the bacteria is lysed and so on, right?
Yeah.
Now, the LPS is used by the bacteria for typically non-destructive things. The bacteria use it to communicate, for binding, for doing other things, for cellular signaling. But the
Yeah.
problem is once it's released from the bacteria, and bacteria are constantly dying, the cells are breaking up, the LPS gets released, that LPS on its own is dramatically inflammatory in the body. Right now, you might wonder, well, why is it so inflammatory? Why is it why does it trigger such a significant immune response in individuals? Well, it's because your body over time learns to look for the presence of LPS as an indication that there's too much bacteria in a given region, right? And this starts in the lining of the gut. So keep in mind that your gut microbiome has upwards of 40 trillion organisms, and
Mhm.
it exists in a single tissue layer separation from your blood supply,
Mhm.
right? So your body is very careful to understand that if something happens to that barrier, you could have trillions of organisms flooding into your blood supply, giving you bacteremia or sepsis, which is a very dangerous condition. So
Mm-hmm.
your body's constantly measuring the presence of LPS as an indicator for whether or not there's too much bacteria in a given space. So
Mm-hmm.
it takes the presence of LPS very, very seriously wherever it sees it. And it elicits a very profound immune response as a result, right? So
Right.
then the problem with gram-negative bacteria is it's making all this LPS, it's releasing it all the time in the gut lining, for example, or if you have an overgrowth of them that move into the peritoneal cavity, the pelvic floor area, or the reproductive tract, you've got all this gram-negative bacteria in that area. And then as they release their LPS, they're triggering massive amounts of inflammatory responses. In the gut, when you have leaky gut, one of the most profound effects of leaky gut is a translocating or movement of that LPS from the lining of the gut into the blood supply. And that LPS can go all throughout the body and triggers massive inflammation throughout the body.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, a 2015 publication in Frontiers of Immunology, which was a meta-analysis publication, showed that the number one cause of mortality and morbidity worldwide was the presence of this gram-negative LPS in circulation and all of the chronic low-grade inflammation it triggers. Because that
Wow.
chronic low-grade inflammation is the basis for most chronic diseases. So it's a
Yeah.
very profound thing to wrap
Yes.
your head around.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Especially when we know that in endometriosis and the dysbiosis picture, so the dysbiosis, for anyone who's not aware, is this imbalanced microbial environment.
Mm-hmm.
We see the presence of excess gram-negative bacteria. So you're
Mm-hmm.
almost predisposed to this excess LPS, and
Yep.
that has a flow-on effect to this systemic massive inflammation. So my question is, how does it translocate? Is it through that leaky gut, the hyperpermeable gut that lets it all through and then it moves around within the peritoneal cavity? Because even in the peritoneal fluid, we're seeing dysbiosis.
Yeah, that's one of the major ways in which it does that. So imagine it can move through the lining of the gut. It can end up in circulation as a result of that. And then in circulation, wherever blood goes, it can go, right? And then it's looking for, if they're viable bacteria that's floating around, what they're looking for are tissues that they can latch onto.
Mm,
So they're looking for highly mucosal tissues, right? That look like the gut a little bit. So a lot of the reproductive organs and reproductive system are very mucosal tissues. The
yes.
vaginal tract is, and so on, right? Your uterus, everything is a very mucosal tissue, and so it latches onto those regions and can grow in those regions. Now, another source of it, well, two more sources of it, is that as your reproductive tract becomes dysbiotic, and that can happen through the vaginal canal as well, right? Because let's say you're somebody that gets a lot of exposure of gram-negative bacteria from fecal contamination into the vaginal canal, those microbes can actually move up into the uterus area, and then they can penetrate through the uterine walls or uterine lining, or they can get spread around the reproductive canal through retrograde menstruation. And we
Mhm.
know that retrograde menstruation is a feature of women who suffer from endometriosis. So that is, when you're menstruating, there's a lot of blood in that area. That blood contains gram-negative bacteria. That blood can translocate the bacteria to different places. One of the areas where it translocates it is as the blood is moving back down the vaginal canal. There's this space called the rectal vaginal space,
Yeah.
right? It's this area
Yes.
between the rectum and the vaginal canal. The blood enters into that area, bringing in it not only gram-negative bacteria, but it can also then bring endometrial cells into that
Yes,
area,
we see a lot
right?
of endo deposits and lesions in that space.
That's exactly right. So that's another way in which not only are the problematic cells entering that area, but the gram-negative bacteria with their LPS entering that area as well. Now, the third way in which you can end up with a lot of gram-negative bacteria throughout your system is through your mouth,
Mhm.
right? Our mouths contain a lot of gram-negative bacteria, a lot of enteric bacteria, as we call it, especially a new one that's really been well established as now being associated with, very clearly associated with endometriosis, to the factor of it's almost 10x. Like if you look at the presence and the prevalence of this bacteria in endometrial fluid and peritoneal fluid, oral bacteria, and all that in people that suffer from endometriosis versus people that don't. It's like 6% prevalence versus almost 70% prevalence, right?
That's
So it's almost a
significant.
tenfold increase. Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah.
And this is Fusobacterium nucleatum, which grows in the mouth. It grows in plaques in the mouth, in anaerobic environments in the mouth, in the periodontal pockets, and so on. It's associated with periodontal disease, gum disease, and then it can get swallowed, which it does, by the billions every single day. And if it survives past your gastric system, a lot of people with gut issues also have compromised stomach acid levels. Survives through, it can drive SIBO, it can drive leaky gut, it can drive all the way down to the large bowel. It can be associated with IBD. And
Mm,
then it also bleeds right through into your circulation from your mouth, right? So you
yeah.
get a lot of gram-negative bacteria because in your soft tissue in your mouth is directly exposed to the blood. Everyone knows this who has ever flossed and your gums bleed a little bit.
Hmm.
You have direct exposure of that bacteria in the periodontal pockets to your blood circulation. So
Yeah.
there's lots of ways in which these gram-negative bacteria can get into the problematic areas, and when they're there, they propagate the disease process.
Yes. And can I just park there for a second regarding the Fusobacterium? Someone asked which one it was. It was the Fusobacterium. So there's been a lot of talk about this in the endo community, and I have ruffled a few feathers putting this question out there because I do think we need to consider it. But if this bacteria is very prevalent within the oral cavity, then in situations where there is, like oral sex or even just multiple partners, that translocation is possible, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and it's
Yeah.
definitely something one has to consider. I mean, we even talk about that when we talk about just general oral health and periodontal disease, right? Which is super common. I mean, I think one of the papers from 1998 or 1999 showed that somewhere around 95% of people in the Western world have some degree of periodontal disease, right?
Mm,
Which means that they have P. gingivalis, they have Fusobacterium nucleatum, those types of microbes overgrown in their oral cavity. And if you kiss people, and not to say that you shouldn't engage in these things, but these are things that one has to be cautious of, is from kissing, oral sex, sharing food, sharing utensils and all that, you can exchange these microbes, right?
yeah,
And if you're somebody that's dealing with a complex and quality of life dampening issue like endometriosis, you have to think about all of these things. So what you
absolutely.
want to do, the basic thing is to, you know, it's not like don't go and have oral sex, don't go kiss people, don't do those normal things that people would like to do, but you have to be really quite cautious about your own oral hygiene, your own oral health, and take steps towards improving your oral microbiome, especially if you gain exposure.
Yeah, yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. That is so fascinating. And E. coli was the other one that there's
Yeah,
lots of research around that too. So
and
how
it's
do,
lots of E. coli in your mouth, lots of E. coli contamination in food and things like that, right? So
yes.
it's quite viable.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The other thing that I want to talk about is, and I focus a lot on this in my own practice, is the importance of short chain fatty acids, because I think this is
Mm-hmm.
something that we can do. Something that we can improve is the abundance of, for example, butyrate.
Mm-hmm.
Butyrate is a short chain fatty acid that's an important immune modulator, particularly in relation to potentially suppressing specific growth factors that we see in endo as an immune modulator. Can you explain to us just a little bit the link between prebiotic fiber consumption as well as butyrate producing microbes and the dysbiosis impact on butyrate production?
Yeah, so butyrate is a very important byproduct of bacterial fermentation that occurs predominantly in the colon. You do have a little bit of it happening in the small bowel, and actually a tiny bit even happening in the mouth. So you do get some short chain fatty acid production in the mouth as well. There are certain bacteria that can, like Veillonella, that can break down lactate in the mouth and produce a byproduct that helps butyrate formation in the oral cavity as well. But generally, butyrate is a immune modulator, like you mentioned. It dampens inflammatory responses. It can negate the negative effects of LPS. And here's the thing, here's a finer point on LPS. It's really important to mention in the case of endometriosis is that, when you have these endometrial cells that escape from the uterus and then make their way to other areas, right? So they can go to your digestive tract, they can go to all over the place, and then they form lesions. Now, the reason they form lesions is they are assisted by a particular type of macrophage. And this is a macrophage that's polarized into something called an M2 macrophage, right?
Yeah.
So what is normally supposed to happen is when you have ectopic cells, so cells that belong to one region of the body that now migrate to the wrong region of the body, you've got T cells that are supposed to recognize that, and monocytes, which is a different form of macrophage, that recognize that. And between the T cells, the natural killer cells, and the monocytes, they destroy and they consume that problematic piece of tissue or that cell. In the case of endometriosis, why inflammation, and particularly LPS inflammation, is such a big propagator of the problem is that in the presence of LPS, the macrophage polarizes into an M2 macrophage. That M2 macrophage actually helps the endometrial cell establish, get vascular blood supply, get fibrosis on it, so it forms this scar and helps it actually grow. The M2 actually reduces inflammation right around the endometrial cells that are ectopic so that it protects it from immune response, right?
It's so tricky, isn't it?
It's so tricky, right? And all of that is happening as a result of the presence of LPS in that same region. So LPS and gram-negative bacteria make endometrial cells sticky and allows them the opportunity to form lesions because the LPS is screwing up the function of macrophages, right? Now, that is exactly one of the types of things that butyrate negates. Butyrate and short-chain fatty acids stop and dampen those types of immune responses. They increase cytokines that reduce that type of immune response. And butyrate also facilitates tissue healing. So butyrate becomes really important overall in our overall health picture. Now, the only way you'll really get significant amounts of butyrate is by having the right type of butyrate-forming bacteria. There are lots of different kinds that can do it in your body, and the ones that do it for you may be different than the ones that do it for me, as long as we both have butyrate-forming microbes in our gut. You might have a lot more, say, Faecalibacter prausnitzii, and I might have a lot more Rubinococcus. But as long as we both have butyrate-forming bacteria, we're in good shape. But what they need is they need fiber and or prebiotics, right? And they will take the fiber and prebiotics. There are microbes that break it down, produce lactic acid. The lactic acid is then converted into butyrate and other short-chain fatty acids. So you cannot overstate the importance of short-chain fatty acid formation in managing the progression and severity of something like endometriosis, which is an inflammatory condition.
Yes, yeah. So, what do you think about supplementing with straight butyrate?
So I think there's some benefits there. I've been doing it myself. I've been curious about the effects of using straight butyrate. I use a product called Tributyrin X, which has 3 different forms of butyrate. I think that the most of the benefit of supplemental butyrate you're going to get in the small bowel, especially in the proximal small bowel, right? Because most of that is going to, the capsule itself is going to dissolve in the small bowel or a portion of the small bowel, and you're going to get that butyrate release in the small bowel, which is great for the small bowel. It can help modulate inflammation, bacterial overgrowth. It can scavenge oxygen. This is another actually very important effect of butyrate. It scavenges oxygen in the environment, creating an anaerobic environment, which is better for your commensal organisms because a lot of the pathogens prefer an aerobic environment, right? So, so it does that as well. Now, I would never replace the goal of upregulating your endogenous butyrate production with supplementation. Right. I do supplementation as just an add-on, but I'm continuously focused on getting the right amount of prebiotics, the right amount of fiber, and having a diverse enough microbiome that I know I'm converting that to short chain fatty acids.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just that some people have really, really sensitive guts or have been totally wrecked with
Mhm.
antibiotics, and just giving them that little heads up with that supplemental
Yeah.
butyrate could be potentially beneficial. I want to delve into something a little bit more controversial because there's been a lot of talk about the carnivore diet in the endo community. And some people are saying they're finding great relief. It's helping to bring down inflammation. And I was wondering, why is it that some people find symptom relief in on a carnivore diet? Is it because the absence of fiber is starving off problematic microbes? Is there a
Mhm.
reduction in bacterial overgrowth? I mean, that's what I'm thinking. And what's the impact on overall microbiome diversity and the long-term implications for, gut barrier function and overall immune health?
Yeah. So I'll say this to start, and then we'll dive into it a little bit more.
Mhm.
If you have to be on the carnivore diet to feel somewhat normal,
Mhm.
then there's something seriously wrong with your system, right? Because humans have not evolved in that way. There's almost no argument for humans having, well, except of course on the polarizing dietary ends. But if you just look at the science, there's almost no argument that humans evolved as omnivores and we consumed a lot of different types of foods. That's
Mhm.
actually in part how we have such diverse microbiomes. And we know that fiber and we know that plant-based material are really, really important and good for your microbiome and better and really good for your overall health. If you feel like you need to go on a carnivore diet or you've gone on a carnivore diet and you feel better, think of the carnivore diet as an elimination diet, right? And the couple of things that you're eliminating that are likely making you feel better are FODMAPs
Mhm.
and likely sugar, right?
Mhm.
So the thing is, when you're not eating a carnivore diet, when you're eating a regular diet or trying to be diverse, you're going to be getting sugar into your diet if you're not very careful, and you're going to be getting FODMAPs into your diet, right? And people who have a very dysbiotic gut and very sensitive system will typically have an adverse reaction to FODMAPs and to sugar. And as a result of that, going carnivore, which makes it very easy to stay away from those two things, makes you feel better. It's symptom relief for the short term,
Yeah.
right? It's an
Sorry to
elimination
interrupt.
diet.
Sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. I just wanted to park there for a second just to explain to people what FODMAPs are in case people are wondering. So they're fermentable carbohydrates that can cause, gut issues in people, um,
Yeah.
bloating mostly, IBS symptoms. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're not necessarily fiber, right? So
Yeah.
that's also a misnomer. Some of them are fiber, some of them aren't. Some of them can be smaller carbohydrates that are fermentable.
Yeah.
In soy, for example, you'll have lots of FODMAPs, low fiber but more FODMAPs in them, and so on. And FODMAPs are very common in lots and lots of very healthy foods, and
Yes.
you're supposed to be able to handle them because they do have a lot of health benefits as well. But
Mhm.
if your gut is severely dysbiotic, you've got overgrowth in your small intestine, you've got lots of dysbiotic flora in your small intestine, you've got hydrogen producers, methane producers, all of these things. Those components will make you feel more bloated, unhappy, and so on. So you go through this elimination diet, which is a carnivore diet that makes you feel better, and then in your mind, the erroneous thing is you villainize the food, right? And
Mhm.
you go, that food is bad for me, or that food is bad in some way. And then people end up on things like carnivore, keto, and all that for a very long time because they have now gotten scared and or villainized the food.
Yeah.
When it's not the food that's the problem, it's your system is the problem. It's not handling the food properly, and it should be, right? So then what is how do you use the carnivore diet, and then what is the impact of doing it long term? Right.
Mhm.
Let's unpack a couple of those. Now, I think it's okay if you want to go on an elimination diet for a period of time, a short period of time, to alleviate symptoms for a period of time, allow some healing to happen. But I think it's really important to start reintroducing foods
Yes.
after a short amount of time, right? And when I say short amount of time, I typically mean no more than something like 8 weeks,
Mhm.
because you don't want your microbiome to start losing diversity as a result of not having enough fermentable carbohydrates and plant-based materials, polyphenols,
Mhm.
all of those things that are really important. So you could do it temporarily, start loading up on probiotics, prebiotics if you can, if you tolerate them, start taking in small amounts of polyphenols and all that as an extract, so you don't have the FODMAP component of it, right? And then start slowly reintroducing foods one by one at small amounts. Try to get yourself back to diversity. And that's ultimately what you want to do, because if you're on an elimination diet for long term, you will suffer a significant drop in your microbiome diversity. And your
Mhm.
microbiome diversity is one of the best predictors of longevity, of morbidity, mortality, and so on, right?
Mhm.
So we don't want to sacrifice short-term improvement in feeling for long-term health, right?
Yes.
So it's a little short-sighted.
Yes. Yes. It's not sustainable.
No.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. Now, I want to debunk something. I want to debunk something about fermented foods. Now,
Mm-hmm.
do the bacteria in fermented foods survive our stomach acid? And is the benefit of fermented foods actually found in the bacteria itself or the other beneficial things that are produced as a product of the fermentation process?
Yeah, so this is a really good question because it's a very common conflation and misnomer. So
Bueno,
I was invited.
Oh,
Um, are you there?
sí, dígame.
yes, sorry, I'm just muting. Someone's mic was accidentally unmuted.
Ah, okay, no worries. So I was invited. This is a number of years ago. I was invited to speak at the Santa Barbara Fermentation Festival. Right, it was a big fermentation festival, and I said, "Okay, awesome. I'd love to speak and kind of do a keynote there." Now, my first line in the talk, and I was being a little bit brave about it. My first line was, "Fermented foods are not probiotics." Right, and I thought either that they were going to chase me out of there with pitchforks and try to attempt to assassinate me, or they were going to listen if I was being compelling enough. Unfortunately, they did listen, right? So why that's important to understand is because fermented foods are not a source of bacteria that's going to go in, live, and survive through the gastric system, the bile salts and all that, and live in your gut and do something beneficial for you. That's not the point of the benefit of fermented foods. The benefit of fermented foods is the ferment itself, the substrate that was created as a result of fermentation. So, for example, you take nattokinase or natto. Natto is a type of fermented soybean from Japan, right? It's considered one of the best superfoods. There's so many studies. It's 2,000 years old. It's an amazing food. It smells awful. It smells like old gym socks, and farts, really. And the taste is not very pleasant. And there's a samurai that's his name is Miramoto, that is credited with the first person to actually try natto. But it is an amazingly nutritious food. So when you take natto, it's basically soybeans, and soybeans have a certain amount of nutritional profile and benefit. But when you ferment it into the
Mhm.
natto, you end up with something like 15 different peptides, organic acids, like dipolonic acid, for example, short chain fatty acids. You end up with nutrients like enzymes, polyphenols that weren't there before, urolithins, all of these amazing things that are not present in the bean itself. And then when you consume that food, you're getting all the benefit of those nutrients that are now created. The microbe that made the product is going to die in the stomach. It's not going to come along for the ride, and it's not going to work in your system. It's the ferment that's really important. So you could take a fermented food and kill all the microbes and consume it, and it does exactly the same thing with the living microbes or the dead microbes. And there have been studies on that. There have been studies showing that you take certain types of fermented yogurts, you kill the microbes, you consume the yogurt, you get the exact same benefit as if the microbes were alive, or quote unquote alive, in the system. Now, why I think that's really important for people to know. There's really kind of three things about that, right? Number one, if you know that the benefits of fermented foods come from the fermentation, that means the fermented foods that are most beneficial are the ones that have true fermentation processes,
Mhm.
right? Mostly what you do at home. most of the commercial fermented products don't go through full fermentation because that takes too long. Economically, it's not viable. So if you look at the kombuchas, if you will, in the store shelf, they're not fermented. They're not fully fermented. They cut the fermentation off by days. So you're
Mm-hmm.
missing a lot of the benefits, right? And then they're adding, of course, sugar and other flavorings and all that to make it taste better. So they don't really have the full benefit or the true benefit of fermented foods. So if you're going to get benefit from fermented foods, you're better off doing it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And the second part, that was the second part, is do it yourself. The third part is that I don't want people to negate the use of probiotics by
Mm-hmm.
saying, oh, I get fermented foods and so I don't need probiotics. They function completely differently, right? With
Yeah.
probiotics, it's the bacteria that's doing all the work. In fermented foods, it's the ferment that's providing you the benefit. They
Yeah.
are apples and oranges.
Yeah. Is tempeh similar to natto in its benefits, or is natto totally different?
Natto is totally different. There's other versions of natto in Korean culture and Chinese culture and so on. Like for example, I think in Korean culture they ferment chickpeas
Yeah.
instead of beans, soy.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing in Chinese culture. They ferment a different type of legume,
Mm-hmm.
but nonetheless, a legume ferment is and it has to be sticky. It has to be smelly. That's
Mm-hmm.
where all the benefit is, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have the stickiness, the smelliness, and all that, then it doesn't really have the right fermentation. Now, that's another thing. Like fermentation typically is going to smell bad and not taste good, right? That it's certainly not automatic for our palates, right? Our
Mm-hmm.
westernized palates. Because they have these weird umami flavors and so on that
Yeah.
we're not used to. And so if you buy a fermented product off the shelf and you taste it and you go, wow, this is good, it's probably not really fermented, and it's probably been altered to suit our palates.
Yeah, it's so interesting. We automatically go, oh, that's not for me, but
Mm-hmm.
there are certain benefits. Okay, so the topic of histamine, it's such a buzzword in the endo community, and I'd love to delve into it a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because when I address histamine, and if any of my patients are watching this, you'll know that I always look at the gut. It's not just about, eliminating high histamine foods. It's about addressing the underlying factors of the histamine sensitivity or the excess histamine, which is then driving the inflammation that is present and other symptoms. So, can we talk about the dysbiosis and histamine link, as well as the
Mhm.
fermented food and histamine link?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with the fermented food side of it.
Mm,
One of the reasons why people with histamine intolerance or sensitivities typically will not do well with certain fermented foods is because uh, in the process of fermentation, those microbes can produce histamine as a result of it. So you are consuming a high histamine food, right? And if you're intolerant of histamine or you have sensitivities to it, you're really getting the full inflammatory effect of the histamine rather than being able to break it down. And that's the other aspect of histamine intolerance is it's not always just about the amount of production or exposure. It's the fact that you're not breaking down histamine into histidine and other things, right? So our systems are designed where histamine can be very useful, right? So if you think about a couple of the functions of histamine in the body. One of
yeah,
the main functions, it's one of the biggest stimulators of gastric acid production and
yes.
secretion, right? So HCl production is dependent to a certain degree on histamine, and so it's used in many different ways. Your immune system
Mhm.
responds to the presence of histamine as a signal for potential microbial contamination or immune activation, where your microbiome parts of your microbiome can produce histamine to signal to your immune system that there's a invading bacteria or virus in a given area, right? So it's a signaling molecule as well. But the thing is, we're not supposed to be that affected by it because once it's produced, it's either bound by receptors and utilized, or it's broken down by enzymes.
Yes.
And if you have histamine intolerance, to me, it's at least 50% of the story that you don't have enough diversity in your gut to produce enough of the enzymes that break down histamine. right?
Hmm.
So it's not always just like, oh my God, there's too much histamine everywhere and everything drives histamine. It's that your system has a lack of diversity. You're not producing enough enzyme to break down histamine. So that's one of the first goals with having histamine intolerance. And one of the first signals is that you've got a low diversity, you're highly dysbiotic, which means you can't tolerate histamine well. You need to start to improve the diversity of your gut microbiome. It
Yeah.
could also mean that you have high levels of certain pathogens, because
Hmm.
again, some of your microbiome produces histamine either as a byproduct of their metabolic processes or as a way of trying to signal to your immune cells that there is a pathogen in the system, right? So the presence of pathogens can drive some of this as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Are there any specific microbes that come to mind that are key ones for histamine producers?
A lot of the gram-negative bacteria are. So gram-negative enteric bacteria, right? So if you look at
Your E.
Enterobacter,
coli, for
E.
example?
coli, yep,
And
exactly. Enterobacter, E. coli,
And
yep.
isn't that so interesting because this is what we're seeing in the endo picture.
Mm-hmm.
It's the LPS producers. It's the one that's, they're the ones that we're seeing in the dysbiotic peritoneal fluid, in the menstrual blood, and in the dysbiotic gut. So the
Yep.
histamine dysbiosis link is so strong in endo. And in saying that, are there specific microbes or probiotic strains that are safest off the top of your head for women or patients with endo who are sensitive to histamine?
Yeah, I mean, the spore-based probiotics are fantastic because not
Perfect.
only do they not produce histamine, they can compete with a lot of the gram-negative bacteria that do produce histamine. One of the things about gram-positive bacteria, not the ones with LPS, so bacillus or spore-based are gram-positive, and lots of probiotics are gram-positive as well, like lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. One of the problems with some of the other gram-positives is that they're very intolerant of bile acids, right?
Hmm.
So they can't function as well in the area where you have a lot of gram-negative bacteria where bile acids are being produced, like in the
Mm-hmm.
small bowel. So in people with a dysfunctional small bowel, they have a high level of gram-negative bacteria. That's a characteristic of SIBO.
Hmm.
You're not supposed to have gram-negative bacteria at high levels in your small bowel, but that is a fingerprint, if you will, of people with leaky gut, systemic inflammation, histamine intolerance, endometriosis, and other inflammatory conditions. So then you take a probiotic bacteria that's a gram-positive bacteria, you throw it into the system, it opens up in the small bowel. You've got all this gram-negative bacteria there. You've got bile flowing. The gram-negative bacteria is doing fine in the bile. The probiotic is going, I can't function in this environment, so it can't really compete with the
Hmm.
gram-negative bacteria. But the spores are really effective in that they are bile tolerant. So they can get in to the
Hmm.
small intestine, even in the presence of bile, they can reproduce, they can compete, and they can bring down the growth of the gram negative bacteria, and they don't produce histamine, right? So they are, and they seal up the lining of the gut. So that reduces the amount of LPS that's going into the blood supply as
Yeah.
well.
And that was actually my next question. How do spore-forming probiotics work? But yeah, that's perfect. So someone asked what they were. They are spore-forming probiotics. Yes, yes.
Yeah. So
Um,
like the megaspore, for example, with
yes.
Bacillus subtilis, Bacillus indicus, Bacillus. So they're not lactobacillus. They are bacillus. They form a spore, which means that they cover themselves with a thick protein calcified armor, and that gives them a degree of resilience against things like acid and heat and pressure and
Yes.
and bile and things like that, right?
Does Bacillus coagulans fit under here too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And in saying that, when we are dealing with, you know, dysbiosis, we've got an overgrowth kind of situation, whether it's SIBO or not. What's your perspective on using antimicrobials?
I think
Herbal
they're
antimicrobials.
herbal antimicrobials. So I think if you have SIBO, for example, right, and I think where the antimicrobial use has gone wrong is there's a significant overuse, and there's an idea that that is going to resolve the problem. It can help you get a bit of a handle on the problem, but it shouldn't be the singular solution, right? So what I see certainly among US practitioners is they'll go, oh my God, my patient has SIBO. I'm going to hit them on 12 weeks of antimicrobials, right?
Mm,
And you're just every day bombarding them with the same thing with the antimicrobials. The problem with that, and then the idea is that after that 12 weeks, we'll start trying to rebuild the gut. But it
mm,
doesn't work that way because every time the antimicrobial goes in, there's a half-life to it, right? After
mm,
5, 6 hours or whatever the antimicrobial is gone from the picture, the bacteria just start to grow back.
mm,
And every time they go back, they might grow back in a more robust fashion. And
mm.
so even if you're doing it for 12 weeks, at the end of the 12 weeks, those microbes are still there. So my recommendation is always, if you know the kind of SIBO you have, for example, you know you have hydrogen dominant SIBO, right, versus say methane.
Mhm,
If you have hydrogen dominant SIBO, oregano oil and berberine can be quite effective in reducing the hydrogen dominant overgrowing bacteria.
mm,
Now, I would take that in the context of probiotics,
mhm,
right? So, for example, I would do a berberine and or oregano oil type of antimicrobial, sometimes say in the morning,
mhm,
and then 4 or 5 hours after that, I would do a probiotic and potentially even a prebiotic if you
mhm.
can handle small levels of prebiotics, right?
Yeah.
I would do something like an immunoglobulin to reduce some of the toxigenic effect
Mhm.
of killing those microbes. So I
Mhm.
would do all of that in the context of rebuilding as you're trying to reduce those microbes, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And this
and
is,
then if you have methane dominant, allicin is can be effective against methane dominant, which is the extract from garlic.
yes.
So if you've had a test and you know what you have, that can be a benefit. But that shouldn't be the only solution. You should be working on rebuilding while you're doing it.
Absolutely. And this is what I want everyone to be cautious about. There are so many cleanses and detoxes and kill off
Mm-hmm.
programs out there. And my gosh, they are using big doses of lots of very potent, non-selective antimicrobials. It's almost
Yeah,
like
it
using
just
an
kills everything.
antibiotic. Yeah.
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 It just kills
So,
everything, and it's very harsh on your system, right? Because if you think
yes,
about your let's say it goes and it kills a lot of bacteria, including the gram-negative bacteria, what's happening there? You're releasing all of this LPS.
that's
Then
it.
all that LPS is flooding through, going to your liver. Your liver is undergoing massive amounts of toxicity. Then the toxicity from the liver transfers to your pancreas and your gallbladder. Now all your organ systems are really fired up. It doesn't work to slam and kill and then try to rebuild. You cannot do it. In fact, my number one recommendation to both clinicians and people is skip the kill step, and go right to trying to terraform using food, using prebiotics, using microbes that do competitive exclusion. And if you're not making progress enough with that, then maybe add a kill step in the daytime
Mm.
while you're still doing those things, right?
Yes. Yes.
Always go to try to get bacteria to compete with other bacteria. That's the most effective way to control organisms rather than hitting it with a chemical that kills all kinds of things.
Yes. So to crowd them out
Yeah,
potentially. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. So what do you think about using Saccharomyces boulardii alongside like a kill off thing? That's something I often do to in an attempt to kind of mop up things.
Yeah. I love Saccharomyces boulardii. It's such a well-studied organism. It's a fungal probiotic. It helps acidify the gut, which is one of the problems that occurs in the killing, whether it's an antibiotic or antimicrobial, is the pH of the gut starts to go up because inevitably you're going to kill the lactic acid producing microbes as well, right?
Mhm.
So if you reduce the lactic acid producing microbes, the pH of the gut's going to go up. That
Yes.
actually favors fungal overgrowth and dysbiotic overgrowth. The Saccharomyces boulardii, which is immune to that killing,
Mhm.
actually helps acidify the gut, modulate immune response while that phase is going on. So I think it's fantastic. We had created a product called Restore Flora PD when I was at Microbiome Labs, which was two of our spores in a high dose of Sac boulardii to be
Mm.
used with antibiotics,
Oh, nice.
prescription antibiotics. Yeah, it was sold primarily through pharmacists
Sorry,
and all that.
someone's got their, sorry. I think someone's
No worries.
accidentally unmuted themselves. Sorry about that. Sorry. Yeah, that sounds like a
No problem.
lovely blend.
Yes, it's very effective. So Sac Bilardi is wonderful. I think it's a great product.
Such a good all-rounder.
It is, yeah.
Cool. I just wanted to give people an opportunity to ask questions, just open it up for
hmm
a live Q&A. We've already got a few questions here, I believe. I'm just gonna have a look at what people have posted. Um, okay, great. So, question about a gluten-free diet. Do you agree with having a gluten-free diet for endo, Kiran?
So it's interesting. There are lots of studies on dietary interventions and endo. Gluten was one of those that showed a reduction in symptomology, reduction in severity of the condition when people went on it. But I think the really important thing to keep in mind if you're looking at going gluten free is you have to replace it with fiber, right?
Mhm.
So there was a fascinating study that was published, I think, in the American Journal of Gastroenterology that looked at celiac and very gluten sensitive individuals and looking at what happened to them the first year after they went on a complete gluten free diet and the next 2 years after they went on a complete gluten free diet. The surprising thing is their risk for chronic disease and mortality went way up in the first year and second year of going on a gluten-free diet, right? And you would go, what? That's counterintuitive. So gluten is inflammatory to these individuals. It's causing leaky gut and other inflammatory responses. Why is it that if they remove gluten, that their risk for mortality and disease goes up? Well, the
Mm.
reason is because and this was in the US population, the reason for it is because almost 85% of all fiber intake in the US comes from wheat. And
Wow.
so right, 85%, which means these individuals, when they remove gluten, they're essentially removing fiber from their diet and they're replacing it with fats and proteins and things like that. And so if you do that, then what's happening is yes, you're reducing the inflammation that's coming from gluten, but you're also not feeding your system the essential fiber that you need. So
Mm.
my caution to people is that if you do a gluten-free diet and you're removing wheat as a result of that, then you need to make sure you're replacing that with other forms of non-glutinous fiber into
Yeah.
your system, right?
Yeah.
And fiber is just so important in terms of all-cause mortality, overall health. It's one of the most well-studied macronutrients in terms of its impact on your overall health.
Yes. And I just love to add my 2 cents specifically in relation to endo and a gluten-free diet. Don't slip into the habit of replacing your gluten like your wheat products with gluten-free processed food because
Mm-hmm.
they're full of junk. And that's what people can often do. And then they realize, oh my goodness, the gluten-free diet isn't working for me. My inflammation is rampant. My gut still sucks. So it's really about, yes, removing gluten if it is worsening your symptoms, replacing it with, like Kiran said, good fiber sources. And personally, when you heal your gut, you'll be able to tolerate, and you're not a celiac, you'll be able to tolerate it in
Yep.
amounts that no longer trigger you. So, for example, I share with my patients when it comes to bread, I would rather an organic sourdough rather than a gluten-free supermarket bread that's full of junk. And
Totally.
that's where it really is important. So if you do follow a gluten-free diet, you need to be cautious about what you're replacing that gluten with, those gluten products
Yep.
with. Yeah, because commercial gluten-free products are usually terrible.
And
Um,
and they're often cross-contaminated with gluten anyway. So
oh yes. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. See, in the US, you can actually call oats gluten-free. In Australia, you cannot.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. Keisha asked a question, and I think this is in relation to the histamine, and it says, does that also explain allergies? Quick.
So allergies, so okay, it can explain to some degree an allergic response to something, but it's not necessarily allergies. So if you think about histamine, histamine is a chemical signal to a particular type of immune response that then elevates inflammation, hypersensitivity type response. So it's mimicking an allergic response, but it's not the cause of an allergic response. The cause of your allergic response is something called a loss of oral tolerance, and it can result in many different ways. So one of the most profound ways it results is from a leaky gut and a dysbiotic gut. Why is that? Well, because what's supposed to happen when you have, let's say you've got a really beautiful gut, it's not leaky, you've got high diversity, you've got great communication between your microbiome and your immune system. What's supposed to happen is when you consume food, the food particles go in as they're being digested. You've got food antigens that are moving through the digestive tract and the lining of the gut. And then your immune system's tendency is to attack all of these things that come in. Then it's your microbiome that goes to the immune system and says, hey, don't attack this. In fact, I'm flagging this for tolerance. So it's your microbiome that's teaching your immune system what to attack and what not to attack. If your microbiome becomes dysbiotic, your gut becomes leaky, there's lots of inflammation in the space, you lose that communication between your microbiome and your immune system, thereby your immune system just outwardly attacks everything that comes in. So that's part of how you develop or food intolerances over time. Lots of people who have chronic health issues will say that, I used to be able to eat all these things and I can't eat any of them now because I don't tolerate it, right? That is a loss of oral tolerance. You can also develop environmental allergies the same way. When allergens enter into your system, your healthy microbiome is supposed to dampen any unfavorable immune responses against those antigens, the environmental antigens. But if your microbiome is not healthy, you get an overt immune response, an inflammatory response, and then you end up with the IgE type of allergic response to those compounds. So it's the end product of histamine intolerance feels a lot like an allergic response because it's a very similar pathology, but it's histamine intolerance is not a cause of allergies.
Yes. And I'd love to go as far to say that I deal with patients with mast cell activation syndrome, and some people
Mm-hmm.
can almost be anaphylactic to things, but not on paper allergic to anything. And, there is no IgE response to that protein in that food or that environmental allergen. Yet, because of the activation of their mast cell degranulation histamine release, they can present like they're having an anaphylactic response to that. So it can be quite severe. So yes, we need to correct that microbiome immune crosstalk.
Mm-hmm.
What was the name of the non-histamine producing probiotics to take? It was Megaspore.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you know if you aren't able to break down histamine? Do you want to answer that one?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you'll feel the symptomology, right?
Yeah.
So you'll feel the inflammation, the intolerance, the flushing of the skin, the stuffy nose that some people get. Some people get dermal issues
Itchy.
as a result of it, itchy patches. So you eat a food and you get that kind of response. You could very well be having an histamine-like response to the food being present in your system, or you eat a fermented food, or even without foods coming in, if you're producing a lot of histamine in your gut, you may feel that way anyway.
Yes.
So some people, other triggers may trigger the histamine-like response. For example, the sun can trigger that in people
Yes.
with high sensitivities, right? So any sort of external or internal trigger that leads to this inflammatory allergic-like response could indicate that you have histamine intolerance.
Yeah. And in ladies with painful periods,
Mm-hmm.
IBS type symptoms can be histamine driven too. Premenstrual migraines and headaches is something that I see often as well. Um, you may, if you go down the testing route, you may not necessarily have excess histamine or excess tryptase, but you can still be histamine sensitive or histamine intolerant. You can go as far as testing your genetics to look at single nucleotide polymorphisms in the genes that code for the enzymes that break down histamine. And you may be slower at breaking them down, which means there can be more accumulation. But yes, the symptoms are what you'd go by. Next question. If you are constipated, is Saccharomyces boulardii okay?
I don't see a reason why it wouldn't be okay. If and I think in part depending on why you're constipated. If you're chronically constipated, you probably have some form of IBS and IBS-C, which is a dysbiosis. You likely have a degree of leaky gut because a lot of bowel stasis can be associated with LPS translocating, making its way up the vagus nerve, and then lodging itself in this area called the dorsal vagal complex, which is in your brainstem. When it lodges in there, it activates inflammatory pathways that then block some of the peristaltic and bowel moving signals from the brain to the gut. It's interfering with that gut brain communication. So you're likely, leaky. You have leaky gut. So I don't see a reason why Boulardii would be an issue in that case. You may want to, upregulate some from fiber, try to utilize some prokinetics, drink some more water, things like that to try
Yeah.
to get the bowels moving. But I don't see a problem with Boulardii.
Yeah, maybe the thinking behind that is that it's often used for like traveler's diarrhea or food poisoning, but yeah, all those
Right.
factors. Any tips for good oral microbiome health?
Yeah, so the Fusobacterium, for example, or the P. gingivalis, which is another problem, and E. coli and so on. Many of them live in what I call these pathogen-like apartments with combinations with Streptococcus and so on, right? Biofilms in the mouth,
Hmm.
and all of those biofilms and all that come as a result of over development of plaque in the mouth, right? So when you look at your oral cavity and you go, wow, how can there be so many trillions of bacteria in there? Roughly 10% of your total microbiome is in your mouth.
Hmm.
And keep in mind that every day, when you think about the amount of saliva that you swallow about 1.5 trillion microbes from your mouth into your digestive tract, right?
Hmm.
And that's massive, 1.5 trillion. Just to put that into
That's
perspective,
huge.
it's huge, right?
Yeah.
Just to put it in perspective, if I have two products here, and I said, okay, these are both bacteria in capsule. Here's a probiotic with say 100 billion CFUs. It sounds like a very potent probiotic. You take this, it might have some benefit for your system. Here's another bacterial product that has 35 different pathogens in it, and it's at 1.5 trillion. I'd like you to take this. You would think I'm absolutely crazy for even offering that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And yet that's what we're doing every day when we're not taking care of our oral hygiene. We're swallowing that amount of Fusobacterium, P. gingivalis, E. coli, Enterobacter, Prevotella, Pseudomonas, all of these awful pathogenic organisms at that level. So then what do? How do those organisms live in your mouth? Well, they live in the mouth because plaque grows, and plaque provides lots of surface area for these gram-negative anaerobic bacteria to grow. The internal areas of the plaque become anaerobic because oxygen can't
Hmm.
penetrate through it. And so that's how they can proliferate and grow at such high levels.
Hmm.
So one of the staples, and every dentist has said this, is really to floss.
Hmm.
Right now, you want to be careful and not use plastic floss because then
Hmm.
you're rubbing microplastics all over your mouth.
Yeah.
I really like water picks,
Yes.
right? Water-based flossers. It also takes a lot of the confusion out of it because I have this nice water pick that you just aim and you just put it along your teeth. You
Yeah.
can't really screw it up. So flossing becomes really important. Brushing, changing your toothpaste is so critical, right? And the reason why changing your toothpaste is so critical is that I just did an interview with Ask the Dentist. It's his profile, Dr. Berhena, who's a biological dentist, and he said if you ran out of healthy toothpaste, and I'll explain what healthy toothpaste is, he would rather you just brush with water then use a conventional toothpaste, even if it's a week or 2 weeks,
Wow.
rather than using the conventional fluoride-based toothpaste, right? And
Wow.
the reason for that is the conventional toothpastes are loaded with all kinds of pesticides and herbicides and preservatives, phthalates and parabens and all that. And then they have a ton of fluoride, which is actually not good for your teeth and not good for your oral microbiome, nor is it good for your gut microbiome. And so it doesn't really help you. 80% of the benefit of brushing is the mechanical abrasion of the toothbrush itself, breaking up the biofilms and breaking up the plaque, right? So by adding the conventional toothpaste to the brushing, you're actually bringing down the benefit of brushing. So what kind of toothpaste do you use? Well, he had created a toothpaste. I don't know if it's available in Australia, but it's called Fig, Fygg.
Mm-hmm.
It's a hydroxyapatite xylitol based toothpaste.
Mm-hmm.
It's phenomenal. I started using it. I have nothing to do with it. I have no commercial interest in it,
Mm-hmm.
but I started using it just about 3 months ago. And in the first like 3 or 4 applications, I felt such a difference on my gums and the health of my gums and the degree of bleeding when you floss and things like that, right? Like very noticeable. And so that to me is a really important aspect. So brush and floss, but brush with good healthy toothpaste. And wherever you are, you can search online and look for healthy toothpaste, hydroxyapatite based toothpaste, xylitol based toothpaste, ones that have no fluoride in it.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. Yeah, that's a critical thing. Oh, here's a few other things.
Yeah.
This is probably not intuitive, but hydration is one of the most important things for oral microbiome health. The reason for that is the most protective thing in your mouth for your oral microbiome and for the tissues in your mouth is saliva,
Mm-hmm.
right? Salivary production. Saliva contains enzymes, immune factors, IgA, immunoglobulins, all of these things that control pathogen growth, that reduce overall bacterial growth, that reduce inflammation, that breaks down food that's stuck in there and all that. So saliva is critically important for oral health.
Mm-hmm.
If you are underhydrated, you don't produce as much saliva. That has a huge impact on your overall health. This is also why when you sleep and you wake up, you have that morning breath, right? The morning breath is basically overnight, your mouth dries out, especially those that breathe through their mouth. So if you are a mouth breather, you find yourself drooling or you find yourself waking up with a very dry mouth, you want a mouth tape so
Mm-hmm.
that you stop doing that drooling or drying out your mouth, because overnight when your mouth dries out, you get a massive amount of biofilm production and plaque formation as a result of that dryness and that lack of flushing of the saliva. And you wake up and we all know we are all very cautious and
Yeah.
concerned about our morning breath. So hydration and having good saliva production has a huge impact. And then mineralization. So you want to have adequate intake of minerals, zinc, calcium, copper, all of those things. Those all have an impact on the production of saliva and the health of your oral microbiome as well. So those are a few things that you can consider.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And we've run out of time, but thank you so much, everybody who has attended, who've, made the time to be here with us today. You will get a replay link for those of you, who haven't been able to be here with us live. And I know there are a few other questions, but I'm sorry we can't get to them today. Maybe you could shoot me through an email and see if I can help answer them. But oh, you're so welcome. I hope everybody's enjoyed this. It's been really fascinating. It's just reiterated the fact that endo has to be tackled from a holistic approach. It is so
Mm-hmm.
multifactorial, and there is no magic bullet, and we're all so different and so unique, and an individualized approach to address all these various factors which we've brought up today is so important. And I always say this to my patients, when we've got endo, yes, we've been dealt a hand that's extra tough, but we have to play the long game for longevity and our overall health to prevent getting on that hamster wheel of repeat surgeries and heavy duty hormonal medication. So yeah, thank you so, so much, Kiran. I hope you've enjoyed being here with us today too. Um,
I did. Thank you. And
Yeah.
you're a fantastic interviewer. Thank you for the amazing questions.
Oh, thank
And
you.
I appreciate the dialogue and the conversation. And yes, you can absolutely control the progression of this condition. You can absolutely reduce the impact that it has on you. It is an inflammatory condition and it requires inflammation to propagate. And so if you
Yes.
work hard to reduce the inflammation and reduce the microbes that drive that inflammation, you can absolutely do well on with the condition. So thank
Yeah,
you for this opportunity.
absolutely. As someone who's, personally journeyed with this for 24 years and, refined my process over the last decade to get to a place of, 99% being asymptomatic, it is possible. And I just want to encourage everyone, anyone who's feeling, a little bit lost or hopeless, that there is hope and that our bodies are incredible. Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening. Take care. See ya.